Hear me.
Скажи мне, американец, в чем сила?
А вы что, собираетесь на ней жениться?
Да.
Ух, красота-то какая, лепота.
Таможня дает добро.
И вообще не называй меня, пожалуйста, Вероникой. Кто я? Вот кто я?
Отныне в русской земле единый быть.
Don't torture me, I can't live without him.
Hi, my name's Ali, and this is the Russophiles Unite podcast, where we watch Russian films and films with a Russian connection. As always, I am joined by a guest, and today my guest is Bianca Garner. Hi, B. Thanks for joining me on the show.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me joining you. That was a bit of a word salad there, wasn't it?
Never mind. Cool. So, before we get onto the film we're covering today, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh gosh, what a question. So people may know me from Twitter. I'm the Film Bee. I run In Their Own League website, which is a website dedicated to female filmmakers and female representation in cinema. And we also have a podcast which we sort of break down topics around feminism and female filmmakers. And I really sort of wanted to bring attention to so many of my sort of favourite filmmakers who happen to be women, and I just don't feel they get the attention that they deserve. So that was really sort of something I just I didn't expect it to go anywhere, but it has actually grown quite a bit since launching in September, and we have a wonderful bunch of writers who are so dedicated, enthusiastic, and really passionate, and it's just a really good team to be a part of. And I also write for some different sites. I write for Next Best Picture, which is a lot of fun, and I also write for In-Session Film as well, and various other places. I just pop up when people need me, so that's pretty much it. I've studied film, so I know I have studied Soviet cinema and Russian film at university.
Oh, cool. So some Battleship Potemkin, I am sure.
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely, yeah.
That one's pretty much mandatory, and that has actually a bit of a place in my heart. As the first podcast episode I was ever on, I was guesting on this podcast called Classic Schmassic. I basically invited myself on and said, can we do Battleship Potemkin? And they were like, yeah, I guess it's famous. So I ended up watching that. But it sounds like there's all sorts of different things that you're involved in. I mean, In Their Own League. So that's been going. It's not even a year yet.
No,
wow. It seems like longer. That's funny. I'm really enjoying that, because I've definitely found that I have quite a blind spot when it comes to films directed by women. It just, I don't know. I think a lot of it is I had a few years where I didn't really watch very much of anything. Like, I was quite enthusiastic about films around my time at university, and then my routine and what I was doing just wasn't really conducive to watching a lot. So then my life changed and I had more time to kind of get back into it. I felt like I had so much catching up to do. And if you're just going through the kind of the so-called canon, it's very easy to just end up watching only films by blokes.
That's true, yeah.
And I don't know if I got this right, but I was looking this up earlier in the week, And since Catherine Bigelow won the Oscar for Hurt Locker back, I think that was 2009? I want to say only one woman has been nominated for Best Director since then, and that's just kind of insane when there's 5 people nominated every single year. I may have got that wrong. There may be like 1 or 2 others, and I just can't. I was just having a not very good reading day, but it's just surprising that we're in, at the time of recording, 2020, and that's kind of the state of things. And yeah, so it's very, very much like a necessary topic to be covering. So I've really enjoyed In Their Own League. So I was wondering, because we've just mentioned Catherine Bigelow, and people will know about other famous directors who are women, like Sofia Coppola, and these days increasingly Greta Gerwig. But who are the kind of underappreciated directors that you would encourage people to check out?
So I think Ida Lupino is a really underappreciated female filmmaker from like the 1950s.
Oh, yeah. I was hoping you might mention her, to be honest, but yes, do continue before I kind of go off on a tangent.
Yeah, of course. That's fine. So she, started off as an actress and starred in loads of films. She actually started in England before emigrating to America. And I love her sort of, she wasn't satisfied with the roles that she was getting. And she would often be more interested in what was happening behind the camera rather than what was in front of the camera. And, she decided to set up her own production company in order to make films. And one of my favourite films of hers is The Hitchhiker, which is a great film that you can watch on YouTube for free. It's all up on there, so people can go check it out. And this is an independent film at a time where independent film wasn't really a thing in Hollywood. It was all, the studio system. People didn't really go out, and especially women. For a long time, there wasn't any female filmmakers working in Hollywood, aside from a few other people. And what I love about Ida Lupino is that she really, is interested in telling not only feminine stories, but also stories centering around men, which is the case for The Hitchhiker.
Oh, yeah. Like, that's a film that if you just stuck it on, you didn't tell somebody who the director was, I don't think you would assume that it was directed by a woman, It seems like quite a stereotypical, like, blokey film in some ways. I know that sounds kind of stupid, but
Well, no, I think in a lot of ways, her work reminds me of Lynn Ramsey's work with You Were Never Really Here. Is that's like you say, if you weren't aware that it was directed by a woman, you would think it was by a male director, and that's what I think should be the case when people are watching films. Is that you shouldn't really be conscious of that fact that the director should just be delivering the best work that they possibly can, and it shouldn't be a fact that we're sort of focusing on their gender, if that makes sense.
Sure, but it seems like quite often in terms of the films that women get the opportunity to direct, they're often films that are primarily, or at least the perception is that they're aimed more at an audience that skews towards having more women in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's kind of, there's so many female filmmakers who do tell stories from a female perspective. I think Amy Heckerling, who did Clueless, is, a great example of that.
Oh, I love Clueless.
It's such a great film. And I think there are certain stories that can only be told from a female perspective and through a female lens. But at the same time, I think it's, it's kind of backwards to just say that only women can direct films that happen to be about other women. It doesn't seem very progressive to me. So
No.
I think as well is that a lot of my favourite films that happen to be from a female filmmaker do actually happen to be about masculinity. Like American Psycho by Mary Harron is one of my favourite films, and that's about such a toxic masculine character that you can get. And I find it fascinating because I personally don't think that a male director would have made certain decisions to show it in, depict that story in certain ways. So I find it really fascinating. You can almost be outside of that, that circle and have an outside perspective and be able to show things in a way that you wouldn't initially pick up upon, if that makes sense.
Sure, definitely, because while certainly men can be on the wrong end of toxic masculinity from other men, it's kind of in a different way to how women experience it.
Yeah, and I think as what is interesting for me in terms of these filmmakers like Lynn Ramsey and Mary Harron is that they're not afraid to take on action or show violence in their films, but they do it in a way that is, I don't want to sound rude, but like slightly more sophisticated in how they depict it. Like a lot of the action and violence in You Were Never Really Here is shown off camera. And I think it's a really interesting approach to take because it's almost trying to show us that certain things that happen in society aren't always captured, but they are experienced, if that makes sense. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I remember hearing that I haven't seen either version of Michael Haneke's Funny Games, but I understand that with that, like, all of the violence is off screen because he was kind of making a point of, like, audiences tend to enjoy seeing violence, so he was going to just deny people, like, that pleasurable aspect of it. I mean, I'm probably butchering his views on it, but that's...
Well, I think it becomes more effective to me when you don't see it, because then your imagination is left to fill in the details. And I think as well is that we've almost come so accustomed to gore and horror now, because it's such a big part of cinema that it's kind of taken away the impact that it used to have. And I think of a lot of classic Hollywood films, like Psycho, which you don't see the knife ever going into Janet Leigh in the shower. You just see the montage there, which is obviously, goes back to Soviet cinema, is that, the power of editing.
Well, and sound effects.
And sound effects, exactly, has more of an impact than actually seeing it. So I think it's very clever that, there are filmmakers still out there today who are using, those techniques of clever editing to show us how there's a different perspective to violence, and it makes it more of I don't know why it feels more controversial.
Yeah, and it can be more thought-provoking that way, perhaps.
Yeah, but I definitely would, if people haven't checked out Lynn Ramsey's work, I definitely think she's one of the most exciting filmmakers to be working at the moment, but she leaves such a long gap in between her films. It's quite frustrating because I just I want like more of her work, but at the same time I don't want her to be these type of filmmakers that churn out a film every year. I know she takes the time to choose a project and work on that and then deliver something that is different every time. Like none of her films are, even though they have similar themes and deal with similar issues, they're all distinct in their own way. They all have a distinct visual look to them, which is something that I find so refreshing.
Yeah, it's kind of, on the one hand, there's advantages, I think, as a director to have like a signature style. And I'm sure marketing departments like it a lot. But yeah, there is something very cool about being able to switch things up like that. Actually, Lynn Ramsey is very much on my radar, but I haven't seen any of her films yet, which I feel slightly bad about, but hoping to rectify that soon. Awesome. Anyone else you want to mention before we move on?
Well, I would just say people should definitely check out In Their Own League's top 50 films of the last decade that we had, because there's a whole range of different films out there that we covered. Wonder Woman's on there, films such as You Were Never Really Here was on there. We had The Babadook, which is again a really great little horror film that sort of deals with grief and loss. And we also had a lot of films that probably people don't realize were directed by a female filmmaker. So, films like Can You Ever Forgive Me, which was the Melissa McCarthy and Richard E. Grant movie, which is definitely one of my favorite films to have come out in the last decade that's just been. So I would just, there's so many interesting filmmakers out there who have produced some fascinating movies from the last decade, and you might not necessarily realize that one of your favorite films was actually directed by a woman. So that's what I find quite interesting, as you sort of go into this blind, and then you sort of you become more aware of what who is working in the film industry, and then you sort of become more conscious of what is happening and how it's slowly evolving. It's obviously a long process, but at least we're giving more the women more opportunities now that even 10 years ago weren't there. So I'm quite excited to see where it's going to end up. Hopefully we reach some sort of equality where we could just go to the cinema and there's be 50% of films showing will be directed by a woman, or
you wouldn't have to look hard to see if you could actually find one that was. It occurs to me that it seems like it's fine for male directors to kind of be big personalities. I'm naming no names, but I think people can definitely think of one or two, but I can't think of. I mean, I know of women directors who are admired for their work, but people don't particularly talk about necessarily them as people and what they're like in the same way that, say, it's the obvious one, but someone like Quentin Tarantino, or even somebody who isn't necessarily a big personality, but people do talk about Steven Spielberg a lot. It's kind of interesting. I don't know whether a certain amount of that is just the society's bias, where if you're a woman, you're supposedly not meant to draw attention to yourself, whereas that's supposedly totally okay if you're a bloke. I don't know. I wonder whether that kind of plays into it as well.
I think say Quentin Tarantino's got a sort of a reputation for being no nonsense. It's
outspoken.
Outspoken. Whereas if a woman, I think there's still this stigma around if a woman sort of speaks up, or she's labelled as bossy or difficult. And there was a famous example of, I think it was Catherine Hardwicke, who directed the first Twilight movie. She was sort of taken off the second Twilight film because she was labelled as difficult, and that kind of followed her around. And it's almost like men are given more chances to sort of mess up, and it's kind of expected of them to be. There's so much about the auteur and being this sort of presence on set, we almost excuse their behavior because that's what the director is meant to be.
It's kind of oh well, he's a genius. He may yell at people, but he's a perfectionist, and look at the results. And on the one hand, I think it's I think it's okay to be demanding and have high standards, but like try not to be a jerk about it. But yeah, and definitely it does seem like for male directors it's a plus if you have strong opinions, whereas as you say, it seems like if you're a director and you're a woman, you kind of have to be a bit bland because otherwise someone might get upset, and you don't want that. So you kind of almost, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Like, if you don't say anything interesting, by definition you're boring, and if you say something interesting, then there's the chance that you'll upset somebody, and they'll say, oh well, she's difficult, as you were saying.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of attention focused on when a female directed film happens to flop. Like, there was so much attention to Birds of Prey and A Wrinkle in Time when those didn't exactly make much of a profit, and it's almost like it's seen as a failure on female filmmakers. For that, and it's like everybody is held accountable for that, even if they're not involved in the project at all. But there's so many films that have flopped that have been directed by a male director that it doesn't seem to, they're not really.
Yeah, give it a couple of years and he'll have another film of a similar budget. Probably,
exactly.
If he's well connected and reasonably well established. Whereas, I've definitely found in my researching female directors that sometimes it's just big gaps between films because it's just so hard to get anything funded.
Well, look at Patty Jenkins. I think she did Monster, and then the next film that she did was Wonder Woman. And that was a huge gap. So Monster came out in 2003, I think, and then Wonder Woman 2017. And she was sort of working in television, but you think something like Monster would have opened more doors for her because that film was Oscar winner.
Critically acclaimed, award-winning. I think, didn't Charlize Theron won her Oscar for that? I seem to remember. Gosh, that's going back a few years. I haven't actually seen that one, but I'm not sure if I want to. But
it's a hard watch. It's a very hard watch, but she's amazing in it.
Like
so
that.
It's just like a completely incredible performance. And I think again it's a film that I'm not necessarily sure a male director would have been able to tell that story in that way. So like I say, I mean, it shouldn't really matter who's directing the film, whether it's a male director or a female director. But at the same time, we do experience the world in a different way to our male counterparts. So we do bring something like, we can sort of see these experiences depicted in, films like American Psycho and, Monster, that I think we would, from our life experiences, would be able to depict. It's kind of hard because I don't necessarily think that anything should be denied to a filmmaker based on their gender, but at the same time I think that you do have to factor in that everybody's life experience is slightly different. So some people may be better at telling certain stories, but it's difficult. It's a really hard sort of to get right. But I just at the end of the day, it should just be the best person for the job who's suited for that role, and it shouldn't necessarily, people shouldn't be held back because of their gender or their race or anything like that. So it shouldn't even have to factor in.
Yeah, and when you're considering a specific director for a specific film, certainly the studio shouldn't be going, oh, well, films made by women don't do well. It's like, well, okay, what has this particular person done in the past, and is it good, and does she work hard, and does she get results from her crew? And like, I mean, maybe I'm being hopelessly naive there, but yeah, you'd kind of it would be nice if people weren't making like gross generalizations about like almost half of humanity.
Yeah, it would be nice, wouldn't it? But that maybe things will be different after we come out of the situation that we're currently in. I hope so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that when we consider like films like Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel and were huge money makers and proved that we can direct action films just as good as male filmmakers, then I hope that opens more doors for female filmmakers. But yeah,
it makes those kind of tired arguments harder to get away with, because you can point to more like, oh well, there's this example, and that example that proves that that's not true, and then that hopefully shuts people up. But yeah. Anyway, so and now the film that we're going to watch today is directed by a man. So that was all. That was all a cunning ruse to misdirect you. No. The film we're watching today is Krótkie Wstrzycz, Brief Encounters, or possibly Brief Meetings, depending on how you want to translate it. And it's directed by Kira Muratova, and it's from 1967. So, B, like you mentioned earlier, you did some Russian films in film school, but have you watched much in the way of Russian films since then?
So last year I caught Beanpole at the British Film Festival, London Film Festival even, which I absolutely love.
I've heard good things.
It's very, very good. I can't remember the director's name, and even if I could remember it, I probably wouldn't be able to say it properly. But I think it's his second feature film. I
believe so, yeah. I want to say he's Alexander Sokurov of Russian Ark fame's protege, or at least that's how he's often described in the press.
Yeah, he is. I think he's very, very young.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about the film going into it. And that's what I love, is sort of going into a screening at a film festival blind and just going in there and not knowing what you're going to see, because it makes it far more exciting. And I was absolutely blown away by Beanpole. It was actually one of my favourite films of last year. It was so superb in terms of, like I say, telling a female story. But I know it's from a male director, but I think he did such a good job of capturing the intimate relationship between the two women at the center of the story in such a way that I was really surprised that it was actually from a male director. I didn't know that until he came on stage. I was like, oh my gosh, wow. He does this beautiful, uses colors in such a way which is so beautiful, and I was just blown away by the performances, by the music, by the look of the film. It's set in 1940s, 1950s, I believe.
Yeah, I want to say it's
just after the second...
very shortly after the liberation of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, from the German blockade, I want to say.
Yeah, I think so, actually. It's so wonderfully recreated, that world, that it doesn't feel like it is a film. It feels like it was filmed at the time of when the events are taking place. Like, everything is perfectly detailed and it's so rich, and all of the story unfolds so gradually that it reminded me so much of like Bergman's work, Ingmar Bergman, and that's what I love, is these slow films that focus on character and absorb you into the world that they're living in. So Beanpole was a great film. and one that I really hope people seek out if they haven't already. And recently, actually yesterday, I watched.
I was gonna say, because I follow you on Twitter. I knew about this. Yes, yeah, and it was your first time around with this one, right?
I was crying at the end of it. I absolutely was. I wasn't expecting such a reaction. So,
but the ending of that film does really bite hard.
Yeah.
It kind of like sucker punches you almost, like it shouldn't do. It's a film about World War II. You should
you shouldn't know what's going to happen. It's not but at the same time, I think it's just one of those films where you are so drawn into the world that we get to know the characters and see their lives, and just the small intimate moments I really found were touching, and it's also very haunting to look at. Like there's very surreal dreamlike sequences in the movie, which just have this haunting beauty to it. It's just so eerie to look at, and I just couldn't. I was like blown away by it, and I thought, why have I put this off for so long? And it's kind of frustrating when I just think, oh, I wish I'd seen this film like years and years ago. But now that we're in self-isolation, I'm trying to catch up on all these movies that I've missed from like years and years ago. But yeah, so I haven't seen as many Russian films as I would have liked to, but I'm not coming into this as a complete newbie, so hopefully that's good.
Yeah, well, this one was only made, I guess, a few years after Ivan's childhood. Yeah, so it's in that kind of era. I don't know that Kira Muratova and Tarkovsky would have overlapped at film school, because I should say, important disclaimer, this film was actually shot in Odessa, which is in Ukraine. So back then it was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and now obviously independent Ukraine. And she herself, she only died a couple of years ago, was a Ukrainian citizen at the end of her life. So I want to be careful. We're not kind of like co-opting a Ukrainian and just saying, oh yeah, same difference, because that would be awful. But yeah, so she studied in Moscow before moving to Odessa, and her dad was Russian, so that's kind of her Russian connection. Her mum was from Romania, so that kind of, I think, meant that she had like a interesting perspective, because she grew up speaking Russian but had that kind of like outsiders input and like, as I say, different perspective. But it is very much a product of the 60s, like Khrushchev, Thaw kind of era. You had a bit more freedom. Although that said, this film, I understand, was very little seen around the time it was made. It was only in the 80s, with Glasnost and there being a much greater degree of freedom of speech, that it was seen relatively widely. Like, technically, it wasn't totally censored in the 60s, but there were only a few prints floating around, so you kind of had to be a real, like, hardcore cinephile to have actually seen it. You couldn't just, like, pop down to the local cinema and it be on, at least that was the impression I got from the little bit of background that I did. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting filmmaker. And going back to our earlier discussion, the Soviet Union did have a slightly better record, admittedly not fabulous, but I think slightly better record of women directing films. But I kind of feel like in post-Soviet Russia, it hasn't necessarily continued on that trajectory. Like you would expect, with having slightly more women directing back then, you'd have lots now, whereas it's kind of like, there's still a few, but it's very much the minority. So there you go.
It's a bit sad when you think about that. I mean, yeah, like you say, you think that there would be now that censorship and things there's greater opportunities for women to direct. They're just, I don't know why that's the case, but it's interesting. I would like to go and look into it and do some research into it because I find that fascinating to see why that's changed. But I know that Russian cinema is something I really want to get into and explore in greater depth and detail, because when you think about the impact that they've had on cinema, you don't really know how much of they've impacted cinema until you actually look at it properly, and then you could see, like, without certain films being made, we wouldn't have films like we have today. So it's a wonderful way of tracking the evolution of cinema.
Yeah, I think it tends to be a bit more of a kind of more committed cinephile type thing, like Russian directors, like that, like we were referencing it. Sorry, my house is going like full old dark house, so I might wait until it dies down.
Oh, that's really cool. I thought that was like someone whistling outside.
No, it's just it's just the acoustics of this building.
Oh,
like,
it's really cool. It's like really spooky. I like it. I wish we were discussing a horror film or something.
Have you seen Old Dark House?
No, I haven't.
Oh, seriously, check it out. It's really good. But it does have, like, it really commits to the, like, creepy wind cliche sound effect.
Oh, I do like that.
Yeah, the funny thing is, it kind of works because they just do it the whole time. Anyway, hopefully, no, that might just continue to be an issue. But so I'll just have to do our best. But
maybe I could shall I do some wind impressions on my end so you don't feel so alone?
Balance it out.
Yeah,
I mean, you can if you want.
That's not very good, actually.
No worries. Well, at least you're not putting sound like specialist sound people out of a job. Yes. So yeah. It does seem like it's not something necessarily known, like, outside of film school, like, has been forced to watch Battleship Potemkin kind of circles, I guess. But yeah, anyway, cool. Well, glad to get the opportunity to for you to watch something that would not necessarily have been quite as high up the watch list, I guess. I'm quite excited to check it out. I think for me, I'm trying to, I guess, broaden my horizons in terms of film. I know that I've fallen into a trap of just watching contemporary films now. I guess that's because I just review, people don't really want to read a review of a film that came out 50 years ago necessarily. They want things that they can go watch in a cinema now. And I just realised that since coming out of film school, I haven't gone back to revisit older films, and there's something just magical about watching something for the very first time and then realizing that how that film's affected other films that have come after it. It's just so refreshing to see a film that did the very first film to do this, or the very first film that led to this film movement. Sure.
It's just, I don't know. I'm very excited. I'm trying to contain my excitement. I love going into, like, films and just seeing that. I have a feeling like I'm going to love this. I just know it. I just got it. This itch in me that I'm going to really, really enjoy it. So hopefully.
Yeah, let's. Yeah, we'll have to see. Awesome. Okay, so what we normally do before we launch into a film is we say a little bit of Russian, and the bit of Russian we say is very famous because it's what Yuri Gagarin said when he was launching into space to become the first human ever to actually do that. And it's quite a prosaic word, really. It's like, off we go. But in Russian, you can say that in a single word. And that single word is поехали.
Okay.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do 3, 2, 1, and then we'll blast off. So, 3, 2, 1, поехали!
На горе стоит алыха, а под горою вишня полюбил цыганку я. Она замуж вышла, раз, да еще раз, а еще много раз, раз, да еще раз, а еще много раз.
And we're back. B and I have just watched Brief Encounters, directed by Kira Muratova. And before we tell you what we thought of it, B is going to give us a quick summary of the plot. So if you haven't watched the film already and don't want to know what happens, I would suggest pausing the podcast, finding the film, watching the film, and then coming back. Otherwise, there are going to be spoilers. So with that warning out the way, over to you, B.
Thank you. So, Brief Encounters is a film that centers around two women who are of different ages and different backgrounds, but they share something in common. They both have had a relationship with a mysterious man called Maxim. One of the characters is Nadia, who is from the countryside and has moved to the city with her friend in the search of work. And the second woman is a woman called Valentina, who happens to be a civil servant, who employs Nadia when she turns up on her doorstep unannounced. She assumes that she's there to be her live-in maid. Unknown to her is that they do actually have a common interest. They both have had a relationship with the same man, Maxim, who is absent at the moment from both of these women's lives. And through a series of flashbacks, the film's told in a non-linear narrative, we see how he's played such an important role in their lives, and now we see the sort of aftermath of his departure from their lives, and that's what's sort of explored in the film.
Excellent. Yeah, that is quite a challenging film to summarize. Like, I felt really bad for being just like, oh, well, you know, it's the guest's job to do this. So I'll let you in on a little secret, listeners. I actually hand this job off to the guest because I'm really bad at doing it. So there you go. But yeah, it's quite a challenging film in terms of that structure, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think at first it took me a while to realise what was sort of happening. I did have to rewatch a couple of scenes a few times in order to grasp what was happening. But I really enjoyed that sort of experience of this ambiguous relationship between both women and Maxim, because it's not really sort of put out there through a voiceover narration, or
no.
They never sort of ever address the point either. They never speak to one another about their lives.
No.
We only get little snippets of what's happened to them, and we sort of have to puzzle it all together to build the jigsaw puzzle ourselves.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you said it. I had very much the same image as far as how it works. Yeah, exactly. It's like you've got a bunch of pieces, and slowly as you put them together, you kind of can see what the picture is and who these people are and what their relationships are. So yeah, that's a great analogy.
I think it's really quite a sophisticated, mature way of telling a story, because you can come up with so many sort of ways of filling in the blanks, and it's like the viewer is treated as, you know, adult. We're not spoon-fed information. I find that really refreshing, because I do hate it when you get films that everything is explained to you. There's always like that one character that is just basically there to explain the plot.
Yeah. The proverbial Basil exposition. Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I find I can understand why people would be put off by this structure, but I found it really like a dreamlike is probably the best way of describing it. It felt like when you're sort of trying to recall a dream that you've had, and it's been so vivid, but you only have like a vague memory of it.
Yeah, it's definitely, and that makes it quite hard to summarize. But yeah,
Yeah.
and I definitely felt like it took me probably about 15-20 minutes to kind of get into, because the initial, like, I think the very first scene is Nadia's having a phone call with, I don't know exactly whether it's her boss, but it's somebody who's senior to her in the local government organization, because she's pretty important. Like, she's either in charge of the council or like very near the top, and that's very much conveyed like as the film goes on, that she's got a lot of responsibility. But it's kind of like quite a boring conversation, but at the same time you do see that there's like affection in that relationship between those two colleagues, even though you're only really hearing, I think you only really hear her side of, I don't know, I can't even remember, but yeah, that probably speaks to the sort of slightly dreamlike quality that you were referring to. But yeah, I'm really pleased that you liked it as well. I as I say, it took me a little bit to get into, but yeah, it's a challenging way of storytelling. How did you feel about the different characters? Because it's a very character-driven piece, I would say.
But I found it quite interesting that you do have these. They're two very strong, independent women who are at the focus of this film, and I think what I like about it is that they don't typically seem the romantic types. They won't, these women who seem driven by something other than love and marriage in their lives. The whole reason that we have Nadia coming to the city is she's looking for work. She's taking responsibility for her life, and she seems very independent in that. And then obviously we have the other character of Valentina, who is this high-figured civil servant, something to do, like you say, with the local authority, and she's living alone at least we think so. She's living alone by herself for the most part, and it's interesting that we see her sort of with that new housing development project that's going on to try and see that side of her career, rather than focusing so much on her
love life, as it were.
Yeah, it almost seems that that's actually in the background of who she is as a character. So you have these lovely parallels between the past version of herself and the contemporary version of herself.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the conflict between her and Maxime is that she does want to have the relationship with him, but at the same time she's not willing to sacrifice her job, which she clearly cares an awful lot about, whereas he doesn't come across like because he's a geologist by profession. We don't really see him doing any geological work. We kind of see him mainly just hanging out, and he just doesn't seem that bothered, but at the same time he's not willing to settle down, as it were. Like, he wants, I don't know, it's kind of like he wants her to do less of her job, but I kind of almost feel like that's an excuse from him, and that even if she did like do less, that he would still kind of want to, he still wouldn't be interested in like moving in or anything or getting married to her. So yeah, I don't know. How did you feel about Maxime?
He's really strange as a character, because he almost doesn't feel like a character. I wrote down in my notes that he's a whirlwind. He feels like this sort of tornado type of that comes in and shakes everything up in these women's lives and then just exits. He's completely like the complete opposite to both of the women. Like, they like you say, he's this guy that doesn't seem to want to settle down, even if things changed for him, the women changed for him, and he just seems definitely the most entertaining of the characters. I quite liked his sort of energy that he has.
Oh, he exudes energy. He's kind of like the life and soul of the party, but that's not always the easiest thing to live with. I felt like he probably did love Valentina, but at the same time he kind of like wasn't willing to kind of change how he lived his life in order to actually make that relationship work. At least how I viewed it. Like at one point he describes himself, and this didn't actually come across in the subtitles in the version that we watched. He describes himself as a free bird, and I think the subtitles just said a free man. And so that's like a big, like, that's the thing that's most important to him is sort of having his space and not like having obligations. And having things on his own terms.
I think it's interesting that we sort of see him in wider open spaces where the women seem in confined spaces whenever they're, especially Valentina, she seems trapped in that apartment almost, and you do have the wonderful use of repeating sounds like that clock that was ticking and the tap that was dripping. It was like enough to drive you insane. So there's that real restriction, at least for her character compared to his character.
He's nearly always outside, isn't he?
Yes, yeah. So it was a really good way of showing that difference between the two. I thought it was a really great way to convey that in the language of film and as a visual medium. Yeah.
It's like you said, it's a very mature, like, confident film, and we should mention that Valia is actually played by the director, Kira Muratova, so she's probably in her early to mid-30s, whereas Nadia is probably... How old would you say? Would you say she's about 20 or thereabouts?
Yeah, I would say so. I was thinking like maybe early 20s or... Yeah.
Yeah.
She definitely has a very youthful, sort of naive look to her. But then, you can see the pain in her when she first comes to Valentine's house, and I think it's really wonderful where she's there with the biscuits.
Oh, yes, yeah, yeah. And Valia is kind of like, well, they're a bit dry, but, they're fine.
Yeah, it's almost like she's got this she looks shell-shocked, like she's been through something, and it isn't until we sort of know what's happened to her in the past, like how heartbroken she is. And
she's all kind of like bundled up in that scarf.
She looks like, so much smaller, doesn't she?
And older, like, yeah. And when you kind of unwrap the scarf, it's like, oh, this is quite a young person.
Yeah, I think it's a really great way of like character introduction. And what was interesting was like this motherly approach that Valentina instantly takes to her. Like, are you going to go to night school, and sort of that, how long are you going to stay here? And it's almost like a friendly but stern part of her attitude towards her. She's like the older woman, but she has this motherly instinct that she wants to try and help her take direction of her life.
Yeah, like she definitely doesn't want to just be pals with her. She kind of feels like a certain amount of responsibility for making sure that this younger person is, doing something sensible or pragmatic or smart with their lives. Yeah.
And she doesn't really know her. She's only just turned up on her doorstep and she's there to wash dishes.
Yes, yeah, that's a kind of interesting little detail is just like the sort of the messiness of the flat, because you just get the impression that Valia just really just doesn't have time for that. She's so busy with her job, and that is so much more important to her than like making sure that she has a spotless flat. It's not quite like the Withnell flat, but she's
she's getting there.
yeah. So you talked a little bit about sound design and the audio aspect of the film. How did you like the music that's incorporated? Because I think that's a big part of the film.
Yeah, I thought it feels very organic.
Okay.
That to me, I don't think it feels that is such a huge part of the character of Maxim, and that it fits the film completely, because I do feel like he is this drifting type of, almost like a Bob Dylan sort of hippie type of character who sort of like, he's happy living under the stars, and as long as he's got some sort of instrument he can play, that's the main thing for him. That's his identity. And I think the singing really helps to bring, because I think it could be it is quite a depressing film, but the singing does help elevate it. So it's not just this sort of straight melodrama. Yeah,
it does add some kind of like lightness and fun to it, even though not all of the songs are necessarily like happy lyrically. Now, I feel like it's really important that we mention that the guy who is playing Maxim is quite a big deal. Like, that's sort of an understatement in Russian, I guess, 20th century, like second half of 20th century culture. He's a guy called Vladimir Vysotsky, and it's funny, like, I came across him as a singer-songwriter type guy, like, or Russian would literally call him a bard, way before I realised he was an actor, which is kind of funny, but, like, acting was his day job. So, yeah, the fact that he has those musical skills that he can bring to the table. And I don't know, how did you get on with his unique style, B?
It's definitely something that I've not really come across before, but at the same time, I can understand how he was so popular and the impact he must have had, because he has that sort of, like we said, he has this energy to him. He has this like gravitational pull that you can't really escape from. Like his voice is so distinct and unique that it's not like anything else you've heard before. Yeah,
I think your Bob Dylan comparison is pretty apt. It's like, I think he's almost, to give people an idea, sort of, if you combine some of Dylan's personas with a bit of Johnny Cash's kind of like rebelliousness and kind of gravelly voice, but that's, only a very, very approximate. You just have to check him out, but
it's like it's really like weird, because at first I wasn't really taken by it, but the more I listened to him and like the songs that I found on YouTube, I was just sort of drawn to it. Like, I don't understand the words and the translation doesn't really come through, but you could still get so much from just the power and his presence. Yeah, the performance. And I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's very much an acquired taste. It's kind of like that kind of first sip of beer whenever that happens, and it's kind of like, why does anyone like this? Yeah, definitely. And one of the songs in the film, which is called Maya Tsiganskaya, that actually pops up in a much more famous Russian film, because it's actually, I think all of the songs in this film are just songs that Vysotsky wrote, and Muratova just incorporated that into the story. I really don't know. I'd love to know a bit more about the production history of like how that even worked. Like when they were writing the characters, like did they know that the person they were going to be casting could bring that to the table? But yeah, so this song Maya Tsiganskaya turns up in Ivan Vasilievich Changes Profession.
It's so random, actually. It's for those who haven't seen it, it's a time travel comedy in which Ivan the Terrible ends up in then modern day Soviet Union, and his Soviet Union like doppelganger, who is like an apartment manager, gets transported back to Ivan the Terrible's time. So you kind of have like fish or out of water antics. but yeah, it's crazy. I highly recommended. We covered it on an earlier episode. But at one moment, Ivan the Terrible accidentally sits down on a tape recorder and it starts playing, and it's this Vysotsky song, and he's kind of like, huh, what? And then he is clearly really enjoys this song. So it's just a kind of weird like connection between this film and other films, and kind of speaks to how popular Vysotsky was, even though because he was frowned upon by the Soviet authorities, he couldn't do like officially organized concerts. He had to kind of improvise and sort of like travel around the country and, you know, do not exactly impromptu, but like underground, like beneath the radar stuff. So it's fascinating. I'd love to do more research about him. There was actually a biopic nearly 10 years ago, but unfortunately I haven't seen it, but my wife Carrie says it's not terribly good. But yeah, it's kind of sad. But yeah, I just thought it's kind of ironic. A film that's really mainly about two women, I'm just going off about this one guy who's in it, but he is integral to the plot. It wouldn't be the same film without him. But yeah, I'm glad that you kind of you enjoyed his rather unusual kind of shtick.
Yeah, it isn't hard to see how these two women have fallen for him, because he's just like this stereotypical sort of like a creative man, but he's also like the sort of man that could go out and plow a field. It's like, you know, he's got the strength there, but he's also got the sort of sensitive artistic side to him. And I think they both want the impossible task of trying to tame him. He's like a wild animal that they can't sort of educate or, you know, he is such a wonderful, the sort of moments that we see him with Valentina, where he's talking about, was it shrimp?
Oh yeah, like crayfish. I think it's translated in the subtitles as shrimp, but I think they look more like crayfish to me, and like how good they are.
Yeah, I like the way that the camera. There's some really interesting camera angles where we have the camera placed inside the water, and we're looking up at them. It's nice to see that being used. There's a wonderful pull focus, which I absolutely loved, where we see the sort of foreground and the background and of like Nadia and her friend walking on the road.
Oh yeah. I think I remember the bit you mean. Yes,
and it's just such a wonderfully done shot. I was just watching it, and I had to rewatch it a couple of times because I was just so impressed by it. It's this way of drawing us into this flashback in an unconventional way of doing it as well, because you're not sort of sure what's happening at first, but then you're sort of, it's like being when our conscious mind is pulled back into our memories, it's almost like this sort of pull that we can't escape from. So I thought it is really interesting that there's these experimental uses of camera angles and editing that happens as well.
And just like, and is that the shot where you've just got miles and miles of road like stretching out behind them, and it kind of conveys the distance between where they've come from and where they're going? Because like I think one of the big sub themes of the film is the like whole like town versus countryside, and at like one point I think Valia says that she like expresses frustration because the party and the government actually really want people to stick around in the countryside because they need them there, but at the same time, everyone's wanting to move to the cities because they know that's where life is better and there's more opportunities. And yeah, it's kind of interesting that you have that contrast. And I wonder whether that's one of the elements which meant that this film wasn't given a wide release, was the fact that it is kind of critical of the fact that the government is controlling and it is kind of inflexible and wanting people to do what it wants rather than letting people live the way they want to. I know we've kind of jumped around a bit in terms of topic, but what did you think of the scene it was towards the end, the scene in the bar where Nadia's really upset and you see the glasses fall from the side, but you don't actually hear it. I thought that was a really striking choice, because it's almost like this thing that clearly everyone else in the bar would notice that this happened, but it's like we're not hearing it because she's so like in her own head with how upset she is, or at least that's how I interpreted that. I don't know if you thought the same thing, but it's again, it's like quite a clever way of, like, non-obvious way of conveying something, if indeed that was the intention.
Oh yeah, I thought that was really good, because we've obviously had sound playing a major role in showing isolation and repetition and how that affects our mental state, because we have when we sort of have that ticking sound that's at the start of the film, and that wonderful moment like you described, is like she's so caught up in her own thoughts and her own mind that she isn't aware of what's happening around her. And it's a great way of playing on that, because sound is just used throughout the film in such a wonderfully layered way. It's so complex, and it's a real good way of contrasting the two women's lives. Like, Valentina's so caught up in not having order and control in her life that every little sound she can't control drives her more and more frustrated, where Nadia is also suffering from chaos, but she's so caught up in her own that she isn't concentrating on what's happening.
Yeah, it's like for Valentina, it's almost like the chaos is a bit more of a choice, because it's not bringing order to her domestic space is really not a priority, because she kind of has more important things to be getting on with, frankly. But at the same time, there's kind of like some shading and nuance with that as well, because clearly she loves her job, but at the same time, you see that she can find it tiring as well, because there's a bit where I think she's just doing some of like her personal shopping, or she's just out and about, like getting some fresh air. It's like one of the few times you see her outside, and some townsperson comes up to her and is asking her all these questions, which is, to do with her job, and she's kind of like, do we really have to do this now? Or at least that's kind of how I interpreted that scene. And I just thought that's interesting, because it's not just a like one-dimensional, this character loves her job, no ifs, and or buts, because I think that's just more realistic that way, that it has that extra little layer. I think there was even a comment when she's with her friends. I don't know whether it's her who says it or when it's one of the friends, but they comment about how life really isn't the straightforward, like, A to B narrative that it is in the books that they typically read, and I kind of thought that's funny in a film that's structured this way.
It's very meta.
Yeah, it's kind of this is almost like a kind of playful wink to the audience, and like, you'll notice this is true about this film also.
Yeah, it's interesting we have these larger than life side characters. What I quite like is the old man in the restaurant.
Oh, yeah. It's kind of funny, but it's tragic at the same time. Yeah. Tell us a bit more about him.
So that's when Nadia is out and about in the market. She runs into her friend that she left the countryside with, and they're talking and sort of just exchanging what's happened, details about their current lives.
Yeah, just having a catch up.
Yeah. She happens to also walk past a restaurant where she sees her boss. She gets kind of annoyed. It's like, I cook for you at home. What are you doing here in a restaurant? Like,
yeah. It's like, I need my own space, and also, yeah.
I mean, it's quite nice because she invites her to sit down, and offers to get her, what was it, like a dessert of some kind, and then they're joined by an old man who's, I guess, is just sort of there at the restaurant, like just drifting about. I get this idea that he's one of these people that's just looking for someone to talk to.
Yeah.
And he asks about their names and says, "Oh, my daughter, is it his daughter who was killed by the Germans, had the same name as Nadia."
It's like, wow, that's dark as I've just met you and you're telling me this really terrible thing that happened to you.
But I think it's interesting that it was at 1967. So it's been a couple of decades since the Second World War.
Yeah.
And it's still hanging there over the lives of these people.
Sure.
And it just goes to show you the impact that had. And everyone's got their own trauma to it. So we have these women who are traumatized by and hurt by the loss of the male that they loved. But in the bigger picture, we have a whole nation of people who have been traumatized by the events of the Second World War, and they're still going through it. So I think it's almost like a nice way of saying, like, well, you think your problems are bad, look at these people who are just passing through your lives. Think about what they're going through.
Yeah.
And then he goes and says that he had a son who he also lost, which was even more tragic.
You kind of think, well, that must have been such a common experience in that part of the world to just have, as you say, like a whole society of people just carrying around that trauma of having lost multiple people.
Yeah, and I don't think we see him again throughout the film. I think he's just there for that one scene, but yeah, it's really interesting that we have like those characters, like the characters of the people wanting to move into the new apartment blocks, and they're just like, why do we need water? We'll just fetch it. Let us move in.
Yeah. And she's like, no, we're not moving you in until we've got everything ready. And they're like, no, now. Which probably speaks to just how crummy their current living conditions are. And that's probably, again, why the authorities weren't super keen on this film, in that it doesn't paint a rosy picture of how smooth progress is, which is what they would want a film to be conveying. Definitely. Just before we move on, I don't know if I mentioned this in the intro, but Kira Muratova herself, she lost her father during the war. He was a paratrooper, I think, who was captured and executed by the Germans. So there's a very big slice of autobiography there, even though it is, as you say, a very brief moment in the film.
But then that's what the film is, isn't it? It's brief encounters, Well, life is made up of brief encounters. So that's what I get. A message from this film is that, even the briefest of encounters go on to play a role in our lives, even if we're not aware of them. So, I think it's a really sophisticated, technical film. And reading up about her, I wasn't aware of her as a director, so brought her to my attention. I'm really keen to go and look at her other work, because she, from what I've read, was working under quite strict censorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so her next film after this, I forget the title, didn't have a release at all, and then another subsequent film had so many cuts to it that she actually insisted that her name be taken off it. So I don't quite know the history of that version. I don't know whether she ever, like, reconstructed how she wanted it to be, but yeah, she had a lot of problems during the Soviet era, but at the same time, because of the way that the system was set up, she was still able to continue for it to be her living, but she just, like, often didn't get to see the results of the stuff she put together. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, she continued to have a career. Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. Was like, I certainly guessed from just the tone of your comments that you'd enjoyed it, but I'm glad that you're interested in checking out more by this director. I certainly am. Although I would caution people that, like, some of her later films do deal with some extremely tough subject matter and, like, include, like, quite graphic violence and stuff like that. So, in fact, like, possibly her most famous film, I think it's called The Asthenic Syndrome. Like, one writer described it as relentlessly depressing, which I was kind of like, it's her masterpiece, so yeah, maybe I should probably see it, but that's not necessarily the advert you want. But yeah, I'm really glad to have given you the opportunity to put it up the watch list. Certainly, like, if I wasn't doing this podcast, I don't know when I would have ever got around to seeing it. So yeah, awesome. I kind of feel like we've covered enough ground on this film to kind of, like, just, like, leave people wanting more and to, like, check it out if they haven't already seen it. I don't know. Or was there anything else that you wanted to say that you haven't mentioned yet?
It's kind of hard to talk about it really without giving away too much, because I think it's a film that you really have to go and experience. And I think even if your sort of initial reaction is, not a negative one, there's still so much there to the film that you can't help but admire. And I found myself at first my first impression was like, that was so confusing. What was it all about? But then reading up about it and rewatching certain scenes, it's grown on me. It's kind of like the music. It grows on you. At first, you're drawn to it, even if you're not initially sure of what it is. But then you sort of just have to accept it and just go with the flow of it. And then you find yourself obsessing over it. So I really, really enjoyed this film. I thought, I found the history of the filmmaker very fascinating, and it's definitely makes me want to go check out some of her films, even if they are, like you say, a bit more depressing. I think she's such an interesting filmmaker who has this distinct avant-garde, surreal way of telling a story, which is definitely something that I like about a movie. I like films that are challenging.
Yeah, and it's really admirable that she was kind of like, I'm not just gonna spell things out for people, I'm gonna make people engage their brain a bit.
Yeah, it's like, I'm gonna make you work for this. You're gonna, there's no easy answers. This is it. You're gonna have to sit down and give this film all of your attention.
Yeah, it's the right attitude to have. I mean, it's nice to have, like, throw on a kind of popcorn movie, of course, but I don't know. It's nice to have both, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think as well is it's nice to see it as a film that has two very strong, well-developed female characters at its focus. Because I have seen quite a few Soviet films and Russian films, but they seem to always tell things from a male perspective, at least the ones that I've seen. So this was a refreshing film for me, because it was good to see a female-centric story at the focus of it. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I mean, definitely Tarkovsky and Eisenstein particularly Tarkovsky, are very blokey-centric.
That's a technical term.
A technical blokey-centric. Yeah. So yeah, that's really good. And I forget which of your other podcast episodes you said this on, but you said that it was really important to you that with characters that you felt like they had a life outside of the film. Like you could see they don't just exist to hit like plot beats to move the story along, that they have like an independent existence. It's just that this is the bit that we kind of captured on film, like, and that they exist independently outside of it.
I definitely get that with this. Like, these are two characters that we could go into any point of their lives and their stories would be interesting. Like, even though it's a mundane life that they lead, I think that they're such strong and well-developed characters that you always do want to follow their stories and continue with them. I would love to see what happened next, especially for Nadia. I think she's a really fascinating character because you see her growing throughout this film, and I think she makes that taking that wonderful decision at the end was
yeah. The ending, we obviously don't want to spoil it, but it was kind of like, oh wow, that is quite an ending.
yeah, and was this the actress's first role?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised.
But she definitely feels very, like, I think the best word to describe it is authentic. It's very authentic portrayal. I think she has such a wonderful presence on the screen. So I think if it was like any sort of director would have put themselves into that role.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that Kira put herself in the role of Valentina.
Yeah, but she is a very, very strong personality as well. Awesome. Well, I think we should probably wrap things up there. But
I could talk about this film for ages. There's so much of my notes. You should see my notes that I've written. There's like several pages of stuff, and I'm like, circled everything, highlighted everything. So
awesome. That's like I say, it's really good when a film is like thought provoking like that. So yeah, and do find us on Twitter or other forms of social media if you saw this film and like found it similarly thought provoking. We'd love to like continue that conversation. So yeah, before we go, where can people find you online, B?
So you can find me on Twitter at the film B, so that's B as in the capital B. And then you can also check out In Their Own League and my other podcast, which is Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. So that's all about looking at box office bombs and films that flopped and analysing why they flopped. So I recently watched Speed Racer, which is a completely different film to Brief Encounters. So I was glad to have Brief Encounters, which was a bit more sophisticated and intelligent to kind of go,
And yet, I think Brief Encounters would technically fit the remit in that it was not a successful film at the time because the authorities in the Soviet Union were just like, nah, people aren't seeing this. I mean, some people can see it, but we're not putting this out in like the theaters countrywide. So yeah. Maybe you could talk your co-host into covering it, but I don't know.
We'll have to see.
Yeah, of course. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, B. I had a wonderful time talking to you about this film, and yeah, I have to do this again sometime.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Okay, and thank you, folks, for listening. Do svidaniya.
Do svidaniya.
So that's it for this episode, but before I go, I'd like to thank Sasha Ilukovic and the Highly Skilled Migrants for the use of their song Cold in our intro. You can find that song and the rest of their back catalogue on Bandcamp and Spotify. If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting us by leaving a rating at Apple Podcasts or at podchaser.com. That second one, Podchaser, even lets you rate individual episodes, so if this episode particularly stood out to you, you can let other listeners know that you enjoyed it. Recommending the show on social media is hugely helpful as well. If you can spare a moment or two to do that, it would really make my day. Thank you very much. Speaking of social media, please find us and say hi on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. You can also drop us a line at rusfilesunite@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, take care of yourselves, and bye for now.